She came to Wyoming to marry a man she had never met. He rejected her publicly in his own store in front of the entire town and handed her the money to disappear. $12. No home. Nowhere left to go. That was the moment Ethan Calloway stepped forward, and nothing about either of their lives was ever the same again. The whistle of the locomotive cut through the mountain air like a blade drawn slow across stone. The whistle of the locomotive cut through the mountain air like a blade drawn slow across stone. Clara Bennett sat rigid in her seat, both hands folded over the worn leather of her traveling bag, watching the world outside the window change into something she had never seen before and could not quite name. This was Wyoming territory, May of 1878, and the mountains were nothing like the paintings. She had seen paintings of Western landscapes in the Boston galleries, those careful renditions of vast open country hung between portraits of senators and still life arrangements of fruit. Those paintings made the West look romantic, manageable, like a place a person could stand in and feel appropriately large. The mountains outside this window were not romantic. They were enormous in a way that made the word enormous seem insufficient. They rose from the valley floor without permission and without apology, their upper ridges still carrying the last white of winter, even as the lower slopes burned green with the first warmth of spring. They did not lean toward the train. They did not acknowledge it at all. Clara found to her own surprise that she did not find this frightening. For 9 months since her father's death, the world had seemed to crowd around her, pressing close, demanding things she had no means to give. The creditors who came to the apartment door in the week after the funeral. The department chair at Harvard, who expressed sincere condolences and informed her in the same breath that her father's faculty position would not transfer in any meaningful way to her own circumstances. The landlord who had been patient for 3 months and then stopped being patient. The family friends who offered suggestions but not solutions, sympathy but not rent money. The city of Boston itself, which had simply continued in all its busy noise and cobblestone particularity, as though a girl's entire world had not just ended in a back bedroom on Tremont Street. These mountains did not care that she was here. And that indifference, strangely, was the most honest thing anyone had offered her in months. She thought about the correspondence folded in her traveling bag. Not the letter she was carrying to Clearwater, but the exchange she had conducted over 3 months beginning the previous winter, with a response she had sent to an advertisement she found tucked in the back pages of a copy of the Atlantic Monthly at the Boston Public Library. She had not been looking for it. She had been looking for something by Emerson and had found instead a small block of plain text that asked nothing dramatic of its reader. Respectable Wyoming merchant seeks educated Eastern lady for matrimony and companionship. Passage paid. She had read it twice. She had put the magazine down. She had picked it up again and read it a third time. It was not the kind of thing Clara Bennett had ever imagined doing. She had been raised in a house full of books and lively dinner conversation taught by her father to value intellectual independence and to distrust arrangements that smelled of convenience over character. Professor Edmund Bennett had spent 30 years teaching English literature at Harvard and had believed with genuine passion that the examined life was the only life worth living. He had also died at 61 without having saved enough money to cover his own funeral, which was a kind of irony Clara did not yet have the distance to find funny. The options available to her in Boston were clear, and neither was good. She could remain in the city and take a position as a governess or a lady's companion in some other family's household, which meant living in someone else's house, by someone else's rules, with someone else's children, invisible, and compensated poorly for the invisibility. She had tried this for 4 months. 4 months in the Aldrich household on Beacon Hill, where she was neither servant nor family, but something uncomfortably in between had been sufficient education on that subject. Or she could answer the advertisement. She had answered the advertisement. 3 months of correspondence followed. And here was the thing she could not quite account for, even now rolling through Wyoming territory, with her traveling bag and $12 and a heart working very hard to stay practical. The letters from Harold Preston had been good, better than she had any right to expect from a merchant's advertisement. The man described the Wyoming landscape with a feeling for place that went far beyond what she had imagined possible. He quoted Thoreau accurately and in context. He wrote about the quality of the silence in the mountain country with an attention to detail that she had found genuinely moving. She had thought this man is worth meeting. She had thought this might actually work. She had thought, at the very least, it will be different. What she had not known, what she would not know until much later, was that Harold Preston had never read Walden in his life. The man who wrote those letters was not the man she was going to meet. But that was still ahead of her. For now the train descended from the high pass, and the valley opened below, and the town of Clearwater appeared along the valley floor. 3 streets wide, a church steeple rising above the false-fronted buildings that lined the main thoroughfare, their wooden faces squared up against the mountain backdrop with a kind of defiant plainness. Clara straightened in her seat. She checked the cameo pin at her collar, the one belonging to her mother, the one thing she had kept through everything else that had been sold or surrendered. She picked up her traveling bag. She stood. She stepped off the train into the afternoon light of Wyoming territory. Whatever came next, it would be different. That much was certain. The platform at Clearwater Station was loud with the business of freight day. Men moved crates and barrels along the wooden boards with the purposeful noise of commerce. Steam from the locomotive drifted across everything in slow white curtains. A woman in a calico dress argued with the ticket agent about a package whose contents were apparently a matter of some dispute. Somewhere behind the station house, a horse objected to something with loud and specific complaint. Clara stood still in the middle of the movement and looked for Harold Preston. He had described himself in one of his letters as a man of middle years, gray-bearded, often wearing the green merchant's apron. That was something of a trademark in Clearwater. He had described himself as a man who would be easy to recognize because, as he put it, there were not many men of his particular combination of features in so small a town. She scanned the platform carefully. She was practiced at this kind of careful looking. Her father had taught her to observe before concluding, to take in the whole of a scene before fixing on any particular detail. What she observed before she fixed on anything was the far end of the platform near the freight office. 3 men stood there, and they were impossible to miss. They were all large, not in the soft, comfortable way of men who had done well for themselves and showed it in the body. Large in the way that comes from years of work done at altitude, in all weather, without accommodation or complaint. The kind of size that is built one hard day at a time over a long span of years and shows differently than any other kind. They stood apart from the freight day bustle, the way mountains stand apart from a field, not by moving away from it, but by simply being a different category of thing. The eldest stood near the freight office window, engaged in a dispute with the agent. Clara could see enough of his face to read it. Dark auburn hair pushed back beneath a weathered hat. A jaw that appeared to have been made from something harder than ordinary bone. His eyes, when he turned briefly to scan the platform with the automatic vigilance of a man accustomed to reading his surroundings, stopped her. Not brown, not green. Something between amber and copper, like creek water running over red rock in the last hour before dark. He was not raising his voice at the freight agent. He did not need to. Whatever he was saying it with the quiet authority of a man who has never in his life needed volume to be heard. The second man stood a few feet away, leaning against the freight office wall, with his hat tilted down and his arms crossed over his chest. Chestnut hair where his brother's was auburn. The same amber in his eyes, but lighter, with something in it that moved a quality of alertness disguised as ease. He looked casual in the particular way of a cat that looks casual. His gaze moved across the platform in a slow, patient arc that covered every person, every crate, every approaching wagon with the unhurried thoroughness of someone paid to notice things. When those eyes passed over Clara as she stepped down from the train, they paused. They took her in. They continued their sweep. The third man stood slightly apart. Younger than the others by several years, though not so many that a stranger could guess the exact difference. He was holding a paper-wrapped parcel of books under one arm, the kind of parcel you bring home from a bookseller when you have been waiting for a particular order. He was looking at the platform in the distracted way of someone whose attention is partly occupied elsewhere, partly turned inward. When his gaze reached Clara, it stopped. Not in the efficient way the second man's gaze had stopped assessing and moving on. It stopped in the way of someone who has been expecting something, or perhaps dreading something, and has just seen it arrive. His face went carefully, deliberately still. Clara noted this without understanding it. She let it pass without pressing, but she was aware of it the way you are aware of a door that has been left slightly open in a house you are still learning. And she went on looking for Harold Preston. After 15 minutes, the platform had thinned to almost nothing. The locomotive had continued on with most of its passengers. Clara sat down on her traveling bag because her feet were tired, and her chest was beginning to produce the particular sensation she most disliked, the slow descending weight of hope becoming something colder. A boy of about 11 years, freckled across every visible inch of his face, and wearing a hat that had been made for a substantially larger head, appeared in front of her. "Ma'am, you Miss Bennett?" "I am." "Mr. Preston sent me to fetch you to the store." She looked at the boy for a moment, then at the empty platform, then at the boy again. "Lead the way," she said. The main street of Clearwater was wide enough for two wagons to pass each other comfortably, and dusty in the particular way of streets that belong to a place where rain comes when it decides to and not before. Clara walked it with her traveling bag and her steady composure, observing everything with the same attention she had applied to the platform. A blacksmith shop sending the smell of coal and hot metal into the afternoon air. The barber's pole. The building that must be Preston's because it was the largest on the street and had its name painted in careful letters across the front. She followed the boy through the door. A bell jangled overhead. Preston's Mercantile was well organized in the way that speaks to a man who understands commerce, even if other things remain less clear to him. Bolts of fabric along one wall, hardware along another. A glass case with smaller goods arranged with professional care. The smell of coffee and leather and sawdust, the particular combination that belonged to general stores across the West, so different from the bookshops and drawing rooms of Boston that it might as well have been another country. A man came around from behind the counter. He was approximately 50 with gray at his temples, and in the beard he kept shorter than his letters had implied. His hands, Clara noted as he extended one to shake, were soft. The hands of a man who handled goods and ledgers but not the work itself. He was neither as tall nor as vital as she had in some private corner of her imagination pictured. He had dressed for this occasion. She could see that clearly enough. The vest was good quality and recently brushed. It did not help him as much as he apparently believed it would. "Miss Bennett," he said, "welcome to Clearwater. I trust the journey was comfortable." "Quite comfortable, thank you." He shook her hand and let it go. His eyes moved to a point somewhere past her left shoulder. In the back of the store, a door opened. The freight dispute had apparently concluded because Ethan Calloway walked through from the loading dock, carrying nothing but his receipt and that quality of self-possession that some men carry with them everywhere the way others carry restlessness. At the front of the store, the bell jangled, and Wade Calloway came in, heading for the counter where his ammunition order would be waiting. From the side shelving, the figure of Reed Calloway straightened slightly, still holding his paper-wrapped parcel of books. All three were present when Harold Preston cleared his throat. He spoke with the brisk consideration of a man who has decided that getting through a difficult thing quickly is the same as getting through it well. He mentioned his sister Dorothea, who had arrived unexpectedly from Cincinnati and was currently residing with him, and as he put it, keeping the household in order. He mentioned that her arrival had changed things in ways he had not anticipated when the advertisement was placed. He used the phrase "change circumstances" twice. He mentioned with an air of one presenting a solution that he had taken the liberty of booking a room for her at Mrs. Whitfield's boarding house for the evening, and that an eastbound ticket had been purchased for the morning train. He called it fair compensation for the inconvenience. The Mercantile went quiet the way a space goes quiet when multiple people are choosing independently not to say the first thing that comes to mind. Clara stood in that silence for a moment. She had not traveled 3,200 miles and rebuilt her entire life around a correspondence conducted in good faith in order to collapse in a general merchandise store in front of strangers. She had made that decision about herself somewhere in the middle of the last 3 months when tears had been available and had not helped with the funeral costs, or the landlord, or the practical matter of what happens next. Clarity, she had found, was more durable than grief. She applied it now. "Mr. Preston," she said, and her voice was steady because she had decided it would be. "I sold my furniture. I ended my lease. I spent a significant portion of my remaining savings on appropriate traveling clothes because your letters describe Clearwater as a community that valued presentation. I have $12. I have no address to return to in Boston because I removed that possibility when I accepted your proposal in good faith. We corresponded for 3 months. You advertised for a wife, and I responded with complete sincerity. And now you are standing in your store telling me about a train ticket. Harold Preston's face moved through several expressions in rapid and unflattering succession. My sister's situation requires, he began. Your sister's situation, Clara said, is not something I was informed of or consulted about at any point during 3 months of correspondence. From the side shelving, something that might have been the beginning of a sound came from Wade Calloway's direction and did not quite become anything further. Miss Bennett, I appreciate your position, but a man must do what is best for his family, and I'm offering you a perfectly respectable. He did not finish the sentence. Ethan Calloway had not crossed the room quickly. He had not crossed it at all in any obvious sense. He had simply shifted his weight and was now standing in a different part of it, closer in the way that large things sometimes appear to relocate without anyone observing the actual process of movement. He was looking at Harold Preston with those amber eyes that had read the freight agent dispute and resolved it without theater. Harold, he said, just the name, delivered quietly. In that quietness, somehow the entire room reorganized itself around the word. Harold Preston stopped talking. This woman traveled from Boston on your word, Ethan said. He did not raise his voice. He spoke the way a man speaks when he is stating facts he considers self-evident things that should not require argument but apparently do. She sold what she owned. She came here because you asked her to. You sent a boy to meet her at the station, and now you're standing in your store talking to her about train tickets. He paused for one measured beat. Is that who you want to be in front of this town? This is not your concern, Calloway. Anything that happens in this town to someone who has no one to stand up for them is my concern. He said it without heat, without challenge. It was simply a fact that he had lived by long enough that it required no particular emphasis. That is how we live out here. It has always been how we live. Then he turned away from Harold Preston completely, and he looked at Clara. She met his eyes. The amber was steadier than she had expected, and there was something in it that was not sympathy but was adjacent to it, something closer to recognition, as though he was looking not simply at a woman in a difficult situation, but at a specific kind of person in a specific kind of difficulty, and had already formed a view about what was required. He removed his hat. The gesture was unremarkable in itself. On him, it carried weight. Miss Bennett, he said, my name is Ethan Calloway. My ranch is 12 miles north of town. I have an open position for a housekeeper. The woman who held that position for 15 years left 3 weeks ago to care for her ailing mother in Kansas and has sent word she will not return. He delivered this information without ceremony, without asking anything of her in how she received it. I'm offering room and board $4 a month and a written contract for 3 months. At the end of that time, if you choose to stay, we negotiate new terms. If you choose to leave, I cover your passage to wherever you want to go. He paused. This is a fair arrangement between two working people. I need someone capable of managing a large household. You need a situation that does not require you to return to a city you have already left behind. Those two needs fit together. Clara looked at him. She examined the facts with the same stripping away of emotional coloring she had taught herself over the past 9 months. She had $12. She had no address in Boston and no reason to go back to one. This man had witnessed Harold Preston's dismissal of her and had stepped forward without hesitation and without asking for gratitude or obligation in return. He had framed his offer not as charity, but as a contract between parties of equal standing, which told her something important. He had not moved toward her in any way that suggested possession or condescension. He had stood across from her and named his terms. I accept, she said. Then she added, because honesty seemed to be the register in which this man operated, and she preferred to match it. I should tell you that my cooking is adequate rather than exceptional. The corner of his mouth moved, not a full smile, the suggestion of what one would look like. Adequate keeps men working. I'm not running a restaurant. From the front of the store, clearly not a cough, Wade Calloway made a sound. Clara picked up her traveling bag. She walked toward the door. At the threshold, she stopped and turned back to look at Harold Preston, who had retreated behind his counter and was making a study of his open ledger book with the focused attention of a man who has decided that if he does not look at something, it will resolve itself without further involvement from him. You wrote, she said, and she kept her voice even and clear, the voice of a woman who has decided how she is going to be remembered in this moment, that the quality of the silence in the mountain country was worth every mile of the distance. She let that sit for exactly one beat. I hope you find it comfortable to sit with Mr. Preston. She walked out into the afternoon street. Behind her, after a moment, the bell above the door jangled, and she heard Wade Calloway's voice, easy and unhurried, directed back into the store at Harold Preston. You just did the worst thing you have ever done in your life, Wade said. The really unfortunate part is you don't even know why. The street was warm and wide, and the mountains were visible at the end of every cross street, vast and patient and perpetually indifferent. Clara walked it with her head level and her traveling bag in her hand, and the quality of composure that belongs to people who have decided they will not fall apart until there is a private moment available for it, and perhaps not even then. The wagon Ethan had parked outside the livery was large and practical and smelled of horses and pine resin. Reed climbed onto the driver's bench and took the reins without needing to be asked. Ethan settled in the wagon bed with a ledger and began reviewing it with the focused attention of a man who manages his time carefully because there is always more to manage than there is time available. Wade appeared alongside on horseback without explanation, as though this direction had always been part of his plans. Clara sat beside Reed on the driver's bench. The town fell behind them, and the road climbed into country that opened in a way that no eastern street or coastal road could prepare a person for. The scale of it was not threatening. It was simply accurate. The world was this large. Boston's geometry had been the exception, not the rule. Did you read much growing up? Reed asked. She looked at him. Of all the things anyone might have said to her in the first minutes after the scene in the mercantile, this was not what she had anticipated. Constantly, she said. My father was a literature professor. The house had more books than furniture. Which ones? Most of them. Shakespeare for obvious reasons. Dickens because my father believed Dickens understood hunger in a way that most writers were afraid to look at directly. Thoreau because... She paused. Because the advertisement mentioned Thoreau, and I found it remarkable in a merchant. Reed's hand shifted on the reins. A small movement. She noticed it. Harold is a practical man, he said carefully. Practical men sometimes need help with things that fall outside their ordinary competence. She looked at his profile, the way he was watching the road rather than her, the slight tension around his jaw that had nothing to do with driving. She let it pass without pressing, but she was aware of it the way you are aware of a door left slightly open in a house you are still learning. The Athenaeum in Boston, she said, letting the subject shift, watching him relax slightly. Have you read much about it? Everything available, he said. Never been east of Chicago, but I know what it looks like from descriptions, 3 or 4 different ones. The reading room is exactly as described, she said. Better perhaps in the early morning when the light comes through the high windows and the room is still mostly empty. He turned to look at her then. For the first time since the station platform, something in his expression went from careful to simply interested, and the interest was the genuine kind, not the polite approximation of it. The wagon rounded a long curve in the road, and Ethan's voice came from behind them. There, he said, and it was there. Clara had not known precisely what to expect. Something rough, perhaps. Something provisional. The West in the imagination of Boston's drawing rooms was perpetually temporary, a place people passed through on the way to something more established. What lay before her in the last hour of afternoon light was nothing provisional at all. The Calloway Mountain Ranch spread across the valley floor and up the lower slopes of the surrounding hills as though it had grown there by intention over a long span of years which it had. The main house was 2 stories of squared logs with a wide porch wrapping the front elevation, its stone foundation solid and level and built to last longer than the men who laid it. Behind it and spreading outward with the ordered complexity of a working operation, barns, corrals, a smithy, a smokehouse, a kitchen garden that had been allowed to go fallow and was clearly waiting for someone to bring it back. The Wind River Range rose behind everything, its upper peaks carrying the last white of winter against a sky so blue it seemed almost constructed. It was not beautiful in the way of a painting. It was beautiful in the way of things that work. "Your father built this," she said, not quite to anyone in particular. "He and every man who ever worked here," Ethan said from behind her, not looking up from his ledger. "Nobody builds 7,000 acres alone." She stored that too. The foreman met them at the gate. His name was Amos Whitaker, and he had been with the Callaway operation since Ethan's father's time, and he regarded Clara from beneath the brim of a battered hat with the assessing eye of a man who has watched many things arrive at this property over many years and has learned to make his judgments early and revise them rarely. He was compact where the Callaway brothers were large, weathered in a different way, and he said almost nothing during the introduction Ethan gave of her as the new housekeeper, starting immediately. He said, "Ma'am," as a complete sentence. Then he turned back to the matter he had been attending to before the wagon arrived. The house interior was honest about its current condition. Boots beside the front door, dishes waiting in the kitchen sink, the particular quality of dust that accumulates in a house where three men have been living without sustained domestic attention for several weeks running. But the furniture was solid, and the construction was sound, and the floors beneath the dust were good hardwood laid by someone who understood that the floor would carry generations before it wore out. Someone had cared very much about this house at some point. The evidence was in the bones of it, the way truth stays in the bones of things. She followed Ethan up a broad staircase to the upper hall. He showed her the bedroom that had been the previous housekeeper's, which was large with a four-poster bed and a writing desk positioned under a window that faced west and looked out across the valley toward the mountains. The linens were clean, if somewhat rumpled. There was a small braided rug beside the bed. "Rearrange it however you need to," he said. "I'll understand what's working before I change anything," she said. "It takes more than a day to know a space well enough to improve it." He looked at her. The same look she had seen in the mercantile, the look of a man updating his working assessment of a person. Then he left her to settle, and she heard his boots on the stairs, and then the back door, and then the sound of him walking across the yard toward the barn. She sat on the edge of the bed. 1 minute. She allowed herself exactly 1 minute to feel the full weight of the day. All of it at once, the platform and Harold's soft handshake, and the three men at the freight office and the road through country so large, it made her feel not small but simply accurately sized, which she had not felt in Boston since her father died. The house and the mountains and the amber eyes of a man who had stepped forward in a general merchandise store, because that was in his estimation what decency required. 1 minute, then she stood. She changed into her working dress. She tied her apron. She went downstairs and opened the pantry. The pantry was better stocked than the rest of the house suggested. Flour, sugar, coffee, salt, dried herbs hung in bunches from the rafters above. A trap door in the kitchen floor opened to a root cellar with potatoes and carrots and a crock of preserved beans still in good condition. The smokehouse behind the house held hams and several sides of bacon. By 5:30, she had a fire going in the range and was working with the attention of someone who has decided that this is the work now and the work deserves her full capability. At 6 o'clock, Ethan came in through the back door. He stopped at the threshold of the kitchen. He stood there for a moment in a stillness that she was aware of without looking directly at him, the way you become aware of a change in the weather before the sky confirms it. "Like my mother's kitchen," he said. She turned from the stove. "Is that a compliment?" "The highest one I know." They ate at the kitchen table, all three brothers together, and the first supper with strangers has its own particular negotiation, its own careful cartography of what to offer and what to hold back. And this one was no different except in the quality of attention each person brought to it. Wade talked because that was how his intelligence operated, through language and observation running simultaneously, each informing the other. He told her about the trail conditions north of the ranch, about the elk population in the high country, about news from neighboring spreads that had arrived with the last freight delivery. He told stories the way people tell them when they genuinely know how, which is to say he knew what to leave out which is most of the knowledge. Reed asked questions, specific ones, not social ones. Had she been to the natural history collections on Berkeley Street in Boston? What was the Athenaeum reading room actually like at first light? Whether the Harvard Library was genuinely accessible to those connected to the faculty? She answered each question directly and honestly, and watched him lean forward slightly at the particulars, the way a man leans towards something he has wanted to know for a long time. Ethan said little. When he spoke, each question revealed he had been attending to everything else said at the table, absorbing it, processing it somewhere below the visible surface. When she mentioned that her uncle had been a physician with a professional interest in pulmonary medicine, Ethan looked up from his plate. What was he studying specifically? The relationship between altitude and lower rates of consumption, she said. He believed the mountain air offered the lungs something the coastal air did not. He spent several years trying to determine what that something was. Ethan was quiet for a moment. Then, my father always said the air up here keeps a man honest. Either it agrees with you or it doesn't. After supper, she washed the dishes while the brothers gathered on the porch, and their voices came through the open window, the way family voices come through walls in old houses, the low, overlapping cadences of people who have shared a language since childhood and do not need their sentences to be complete to be understood. She went upstairs at 9. Through the west window, she could see a lantern moving slowly through the dark yard, and the near pastures, a single point of warm light conducting its patient circuit of the property before it would return to the barn and go dark for the night. She watched it for a while. Then she lay down and closed her eyes, and for the first time in 9 months, the particular cold weight that had lived in her chest since her father's death was not waiting for her when she settled. Amos Whitaker appeared at the kitchen door each morning at 5:30, hat in hand, taking his coffee from Clara without asking for it, and sitting at the corner of the kitchen table in the position of a man making up his mind about something with the patience of someone who has all the time necessary for a correct conclusion. On the third morning, he said without preamble, "Mrs. Finch was here 15 years. I know," Clara said. "You trying to be her, I'm trying to be useful. That is where most worthwhile things start." He drank his coffee. He looked at her for another moment. Then, with no particular transition, he told her that the root cellar trap door would jam if lifted too quickly. He told her that the smokehouse padlock had a particular angle of approach that made it cooperate without forcing. He told her that the well rope had a splice 3 feet from the bucket showing wear and needing attention within the month. He was not instructing her. He was giving her information the way one working person gives another working person information that will help them do their job properly. When he left, Clara understood that Amos Whitaker had made his initial assessment, and it was provisionally in her favor. She worked through the house with systematic attention across the following days, moving room by room the way you move through any task that rewards patience more than speed. She did not rearrange. She did not impose. She restored, which is a different thing entirely and requires more careful looking than most people are willing to give. On the 4th afternoon working in the study, she found the bookshelf. 214 volumes. History, natural science, literature, agricultural, manuals, and surveys. Several had a name written on the front-end paper in a clear and carefully formed hand, Catherine Calloway. A woman who had taught school before marrying into this land and bringing her library with her. Clara ran her fingers along the spines. The Audubon, the Thoreau well-worn at the spine in a way that told her it had been read more than once. The complete Shakespeare in a single heavy volume. 3 small readers for early school children, each in a different size of childish handwriting. 3 boys learning to read in this room. She was standing at the shelf with one hand resting on a spine when she heard Ethan behind her. "My mother's collection," he said from the doorway. "She had excellent taste." "She would have liked you." He said it quickly and seemed to recognize in the same moment that he had said it, and moved on with the efficiency of a man who has learned to redirect attention away from moments of unguarded revelation. "I'm riding out to the north pasture, back after dark. I'll keep a plate warm." He touched the brim of his hat and was gone. She stood in the study a moment longer after his footsteps faded. Then she went back to work. It was on the 5th afternoon that the photograph fell from between 2 survey maps, on the upper shelf of the study, where it had apparently been stored between those specific maps for a reason she did not know and did not need to know. She caught it before it reached the floor. A studio portrait. A young woman, perhaps 20 years old, with dark hair and clear, direct eyes, and the expression of someone who is happy in a way she has not yet learned to conceal from the camera. She was holding a newborn with the particular careful attention that newborns require from everyone in the room. Beside her stood Ethan Calloway, younger by several years, but recognizable in every physical particular except one. He was looking at the woman and the child with his face completely open, an openness that Clara had not once seen on that face in 5 days of living in the same house, an openness that suggested it had existed fully and completely at one time, and then at some particular moment that did not announce itself had been covered over. She turned the photograph over, 2 words, Ethan's handwriting. She recognized it from the contract she had signed. Eleanor. James. She stood very still. Outside the study window, the afternoon wind moved through the corral, and one of the horses shifted and blew and settled. The mountains held their positions in the window frame, as they had held them through everything that had happened in this valley before this afternoon, and would hold them through everything that came after, indifferent and permanent and entirely unmoved by the weight of 2 words written on the back of a photograph. She placed the photograph back between the survey maps at exactly the same angle and depth she had found it. She straightened the maps. She returned to her dusting. She did not mention it that evening. She did not mention it the next day. But she understood now more fully than before what it meant to build something for a future, and then have the future removed without notice or consultation, and to keep building anyway. Because stopping would require acknowledging that the thing you had built it for was not coming back. And some mornings that acknowledgement was simply not possible to make. And so you went out and checked the fence line instead. By the end of the first week, the house had transformed in the way that careful and sustained attention transforms spaces. Not all at once and not dramatically. Visibly. The windows caught the light differently. The kitchen produced the particular warmth of a room that is used well. The kitchen garden, which Clara had begun to rehabilitate in the late afternoons after the indoor work was done, showed the first small signs of willingness to come back. On Sunday morning, Ethan drove the wagon to Clearwater for the church service. Clara rode in the back with Reed, who brought a book he did not open but carried with him the way some men carry hats, even when they do not intend to put them on. Wade rode alongside on horseback without explaining himself. At the church, people looked at Clara with the straightforward curiosity of small communities encountering new elements, curious but not unkind, the way people look when they have already heard the broad outlines of a story and are now filling in the details with the actual person. After the service, a woman came through the dispersing congregation with the directness of someone who has decided not to wait for a formal introduction. "Margaret Holt," she said. "I run the school here. One teacher, 42 children, and a curriculum that has needed improving for some time." "What did you study?" "Literature," Clara said. "And other things." "Could you teach?" "I could." "Good," Margaret Holt said. "Come find me when you're properly settled. We'll talk." And she moved on through the crowd before Clara could formulate a response. Vera Whitaker found her by the wagon after the service ended. She was a compact, warm, unsentimental woman who looked at Clara for a long moment without speaking, and then issued an invitation for coffee on Tuesday afternoon in the tone of someone stating what would occur rather than requesting permission for it. On Tuesday, Vera sat at the kitchen table of the main house and drank her coffee and looked around the room with the careful satisfaction of a woman who notices the difference between a kitchen that is merely clean and a kitchen that is being used with knowledge and intention. "Amos says you're not trying to be Mrs. Finch," she said. "I'm not." "Good. Mrs. Finch was Mrs. Finch and you're something else entirely." She set her cup down. "Clearwater's small enough that it helps to know which thing you are." "I'm the housekeeper," Clara said. "For now." Vera looked at her over the rim of her cup. Something in the quality of that look suggested she had noticed those last 2 words and had formed an opinion about them that she was not yet ready to share. "For now," Vera agreed and returned to her coffee. On the 7th evening, Clara sat at the kitchen table after supper reading by lamplight. Ethan and Wade had ridden out to check a far section of fence line that Amos had reported needing attention. Reed sat at the other end of the table with the journal he wrote in each morning and returned to at intervals throughout the day. He wrote for a while. He stopped. He watched the lamp flame. He wrote several more lines and stopped again. Clara read without appearing to notice any of this. At last, Reed set his pen down. He looked at the tabletop rather than at her. "Miss Bennet," he said, "there is something I think you should know about those letters." She put her book down. He looked at the lamp. Harold Preston is a competent merchant and an almost entirely incapable correspondent. When he received responses to his advertisement, he could not write suitable replies to any of them. He came to me. He paused. "I have a reputation in Clearwater for helping people with documents when they need documents produced. I agreed to assist him with his correspondence as a paid service." Clara's hands were folded on the table. She said nothing. "I read your letters," Reed said, "all 3 months of them, and I wrote the replies." He finally looked directly at her. "Not the way a secretary passes information between parties. I answered them the way you deserve to be answered, which is to say honestly from what I actually know and think and believe about this country and this life." He stopped. "That was the first mistake. The second was continuing after I understood fully what I was doing and who I was doing it to." The kitchen held its silence. "The man in those letters," Clara said. Her voice was level, controlled in the way of a person who has decided to process the full weight of a thing, later in private, and to deal with its immediate surface now. "The one who wrote about the quality of the stars at altitude and the way the light on the Wind River changes in the last hour before dark. That was you." "Yes." She looked at the lamp. Outside, the Wyoming night covered everything in its enormous darkness, patient and indifferent and complete. "Could we talk about this properly tomorrow?" Reed asked. "When I have organized better what I need to say." "Most important things can be said plainly," she said. "But yes, tomorrow." She picked up her book. She looked at the page. She did not read a single word of it for the next 20 minutes. The clock on the mantel measured out the silence in its steady intervals. The lamp burned without variation. She had known somewhere, beneath the things she had chosen to consciously think about, that something had not been quite right about those letters. The man who wrote them was not the man who had placed the advertisement. She had felt this without naming it the way you feel the change in a season before the specific day that confirms it. She had not expected the explanation to be sitting 6 feet away from her at a kitchen table with an open journal and a pen set down. She said goodnight to Reed. She went upstairs. Through the window of her room, the distant lanterns moved along the fence line in the dark as Ethan and Wade completed their ride. She watched the lights for a while. Then she laid down on the bed in the room that had begun in the way of rooms that are slept in by people who intend to stay to feel like hers. She thought about letters written in one man's name, but another man's voice. She thought about amber eyes across a mercantile counter that had looked at her and seen someone worth standing up for. She thought about a photograph between 2 survey maps and 2 names written in careful handwriting on the back of it, and the quality of openness on a man's face that exists now only in a photograph and nowhere else that she has been able to see. She did not know yet what all of it added up to, but she knew with the same bone-deep certainty that had carried her from Boston toward an advertisement in the back of a magazine that she was not going anywhere. The mountains were outside the window. The ranch was all around her. The night was enormous and patient and did not require her to explain herself to it. For the first time in 9 months, that was enough. The morning after Reed's confession, Clara was in the kitchen garden at 7 o'clock on her knees in the dirt, rehabilitating a row of carrot beds that had been left to their own devices long enough to form strong opinions about it. She heard him come across the yard and find a place to sit on the low stone wall at the garden's edge. She did not look up. Reed Calloway, she had learned in 9 days, was a man who could wait. This was rarer than it should have been, and she recognized it as a kind of courtesy, the kind that does not announce itself. When she finally sat back on her heels and looked at him, he began without preamble, which she appreciated more than he likely knew. Harold Preston had placed his advertisement in 4 newspapers and received 8 responses. He had been incapable of producing a reply to any of them that would satisfy a woman of reasonable education and expectation. Reed had a known reputation in Clearwater as the man you consulted when you needed a document produced correctly. Contracts, letters of introduction, careful correspondence of any kind. Preston had come to him and offered payment for the service. Reed had accepted. He had read all 8 responses. Clara's was by a significant distance the most serious and the most genuinely interested. He had written back. And in writing back, he had made the first of what he now understood to be a sequence of poor decisions, each one following naturally from the one before, in the way that poor decisions tend to do when a person is not paying strict enough attention to what they are actually doing. I told myself it was ordinary secretarial work, he said, that a clerk writing correspondence for an employer is a routine arrangement, which is true as far as it goes. It goes quite a way, Clara said, and then it stops. Yes. He looked at his hands. It stops when the correspondence ceases to be a transaction between an employer and a potential business associate and becomes something else. When you wrote about your father's library and what it meant to grow up surrounded by books, I did not answer as Harold Preston would have answered because Harold Preston would not have understood the question. I answered as myself. He paused. And then I kept answering as myself for 3 months. The garden was quiet around them. A meadowlark somewhere beyond the fence line made its argument to the morning. The man who wrote about the stars at altitude, she said. She had said this the night before and was saying it again, not because she needed to hear his confirmation, but because she needed to hear herself say it with one night's distance behind her. The one who described the way the aspen groves look in October when the leaves are fully turned and the light comes through them. That was you. Yes? It was worth reading. He looked up. There was something in his expression that she thought might be the beginning of relief, though it had not fully arrived yet. It was waiting to see what followed. I knew when you arrived what I had done, he said. I knew it the moment you stepped off the train. I had been telling myself for weeks that Harold would do right by the situation, that the arrangement would work, regardless of who had written the letters, that the outcome would justify the method. He stopped. Standing on that platform, watching Harold send a boy to meet you, I understood for the first time with complete clarity that none of those things were true and that I had known they were not true and had chosen to proceed anyway. Clara looked at the carrot bed she had been working on. The soil was good here. The problem was simply neglect, which was a solvable problem unlike most of the ones she had been dealing with. I'll need some time, she said. Not to be angry. I don't think I'm going to be angry particularly, but to decide what to do with it. She picked up her trowel again. What you wrote deserved to be written to someone. I'm glad it was written to me. That is an honest thing I can say right now, and I mean it. The rest needs some thinking. Reed nodded. He sat on the stone wall for another few minutes, not speaking, not requiring her to fill the silence, and then he stood and went to find his horse. He did not tell his brothers. She did not raise the matter with Ethan. But the knowledge of it sat in the kitchen garden and in the library, and in the particular careful quality of Reed's attention to her in the days that followed like a stone placed in a stream that changes the direction of the water moving around it without anyone being required to announce the change. The house continued its transformation under her hands, room by room, day by day, with the patience she had inherited from her father and the practicality she had acquired on her own. The windows on the south side of the building caught the afternoon light in a way that had not been visible when they were dusty, and the reflection off them in the late hours reached the study in a wash of warm gold that made the bookshelves glow. She noticed this on the afternoon she finished the south room and went to the study to see whether the light had changed there too, and stood in the doorway watching it for a moment before returning to work. Ethan noticed the house changing in the way that people notice things they have stopped consciously seeing when those things begin to look different from what they have grown accustomed to. He came in from the barn one evening and stood at the kitchen threshold for a beat longer than usual, looking at the room the way a man looks at a thing that is familiar and unfamiliar at the same time, recalibrating. He said nothing. He washed his hands at the pump sink and sat down to supper. But that evening, when she was reading in the sitting room after the dishes were done, he came in and took his chair and opened his agricultural quarterly, and this was different from the first evenings when he had read in the study alone, with the door partially closed. She did not point this out. She was reasonably certain he was aware of it himself. Wade continued to be Wade, which was to say that his presence in any room immediately increased the density of information moving through it. He had a particular gift for arriving at the kitchen at the precise moment when coffee was fresh and food was ready, which she suspected was less coincidental than it appeared. He asked her on the third week whether she could shoot. Well enough not to hit someone on my own side, she said. Wade considered this answer with genuine seriousness for a moment. Then he said, all right, in the tone of a man who has received an answer that covers the relevant ground, and poured himself a cup of coffee and moved on. It was on a Wednesday in the third week that Gideon Parks was thrown. He was 24, one of the younger hands, and the horse that threw him was a bay gelding that Amos had flagged twice as unpredictable around unfamiliar riders. The horse made its objection to Gideon's handling at the North Corral with the decisive lack of ambiguity that horses bring to these situations. And when Gideon came down, he came down badly, his left ankle taking the full impact against a fence post, his head striking a flat rock at the corral's edge with a sound that the two hands who witnessed it would not describe in any useful detail afterward, because some sounds are too specific in what they mean to be repeated casually. Amos came to the kitchen at a run, not a running man by nature or by habit. Doc Greer's 30 miles out, he said. Kellerman Place delivery. Could be hours. Parks has a broken ankle and a head wound that won't stop bleeding. Clara put down the bread dough she had been working. She was already thinking in the organized sequential ways she had learned from her uncle, who had believed that the primary enemy of effective medical response was not ignorance, but panic, and that the best antidote to panic was a clear order of operations established before the crisis and followed during it. She told Amos what she needed from the supply closet. She was already moving. The bunkhouse was dim and smelled of unwashed wool and the particular metallic quality of blood. Gideon Parks lay on a narrow bed with the pallor of a young man who has expended his body's immediate reserves on the act of survival and has nothing left over for presentation. His left ankle was visibly wrong, the kind of wrongness that announces itself clearly even to an untrained eye, and the gash across his right temple had bled with the extravagance that head wounds deploy, regardless of their actual severity, so that the pillow beneath him was dramatically red, and he looked considerably worse than the injury actually was, though bad enough in any case. Ethan was already there, kneeling beside the bed, one hand resting on Gideon's shoulder with the steadying weight of a man who has no capacity to fix this particular problem and is expressing that incapacity through the only physical language available to him. He looked up when Clara came in, not at the supplies she was carrying, at her face. He read something there that appeared to satisfy a question he had been asking himself since Amos left. "What do you need from me?" he said. She had thought about this later many times. Not the words themselves, which were simple enough, the weight of them, the complete absence in his voice of the alternative question, which would have been some version of, "Are you certain you know what you are doing? Or should we wait for the doctor, or is there someone better suited to handle this?" He asked her what she needed from him. He framed her as the authority in the room before she had established any claim to it on the evidence of what he had read in her face when she came through the door. "Hold his shoulders," she said, "both hands. He cannot move when I work the head wound." He took his position. She worked with the steadiness of hands that have been told by a physician uncle who believed that steadiness was a choice and not a gift, that whatever you feel in a crisis, you feel with your mind, which leaves your hands available for the task. She cleaned the head wound and stitched it 8 sutures small, and even while Gideon hissed and periodically questioned the existence of God with some specificity, and Ethan held him immovable with the quiet relentlessness of a man whose body has never accepted the idea of yielding. Wade held the lamp. Reed stood inside the door in the position of someone ready to be useful and waiting to be told how. The ankle required a different kind of management. She explained what was needed to Ethan in the clear language of function traction applied along the axis of the bone, while she guided the fractured ends back toward alignment, requiring his strength and her direction, working together without lag or hesitation. He listened. He did not ask whether she was sure. He positioned himself exactly as she described and waited for her signal. They worked together for perhaps 4 minutes. Gideon made a sound that the bunkhouse walls would hold on to for some time. The bone seated. She splinted it with the wooden braces she had fashioned that morning and bound it with clean strips of linen. When she stepped back, all 4 of them were damp with the particular sweat of sustained focused effort, and Gideon had slipped into the exhausted, slightly stunned quiet of a body that has spent everything it had on getting through the last 20 minutes. Outside the bunkhouse in the cooling air of the early evening, Ethan stood beside her and said, "You have done this before." "I've watched it done." Carefully. She looked at her hands, which were steady. "My uncle believed that people capable of learning medicine were wasted not learning it, particularly women who were more likely to be present when it was needed and less likely to be given the opportunity to acquire it." He was right. They walked back toward the main house together through the yard in the last of the light, and the ground between the bunkhouse and the house was uneven in the way of working yards that are built for use rather than appearance, and the unevenness brought them into occasional contact shoulder to arm without either of them adjusting away from it. "You keep surprising me," he said. "Is that a problem?" He considered it. "No," he said. "It's the opposite of a problem." The kitchen, when they reached it, held the warmth of the stove and the smell of supper she had left keeping. She poured water for both of them, and they stood at the counter in a comfortable proximity that had not been there in the first week and was simply present now without either of them having taken a specific step toward creating it. It was 2 mornings after Gideon's injury that Clara found the receipt. She had been in the study retrieving a supply ledger that Ethan had asked her to check, and the ledger was on the desk beneath a stack of correspondence. And when she moved the correspondence to get to it, the top sheet shifted, and one slid partly off the edge, and she caught it, and in the process of catching it read, because it was directly in front of her eyes, and she could not unread what she had already seen, a notation that stopped her. "Whitfield Boarding House, 3 months room rental, paid in advance, Miss C. Bennett, dated the 18th of May, 1878. The 18th of May, the day she had arrived in Clearwater. She stood at the desk and looked at this notation for a long moment. Then she placed the paper back exactly where it had been retrieved, the ledger she had come for, and left the study. That evening, when the brothers had dispersed and she and Ethan were in the sitting room, in the reading arrangement that had become habitual without being declared, she looked up from her book. "I saw the receipt from Whitfield's boarding house," she said, "in the supply correspondence." He did not pretend not to know which receipt she meant. He looked at her with the direct, uncomplicated gaze he brought to everything that required honesty. "People shouldn't be in a situation where they stay because they have nowhere else to go," he said. "That's not the kind of arrangement I want to run. If someone is here, I want it to be because they choose to be here, not because they've run out of options." He paused one beat. "You had run out of options when you arrived. I wanted to make sure that didn't continue to be true." She looked at him across the room. This man who had stepped forward in a general merchandise store because decency required it, and had then quietly and without mentioning it to anyone, purchased 3 months of guaranteed shelter for a woman he had known for approximately 40 minutes, so that her decision to stay or go would be made freely rather than under the pressure of having nowhere to go. "Thank you," she said. He nodded once and returned to his quarterly. She returned to her book. But something had changed in the architecture of what she understood about Ethan Calloway. The picture she had been building of him from observation and small evidence added a piece that altered the proportions of several others. Not a man who did good things when they were visible. A man who did good things and did not mention them. The evening rides began in the 4th week as what Ethan described as practical orientation, meaning that someone responsible for managing the household should understand the geography of the property they were managing. This was a reasonable statement. It was also, she noticed, something he could have asked Amos to provide at any point in the preceding weeks without requiring his own participation. She did not mention this. He took her to the places he knew best, which turned out to be the places he returned to himself when the work was done and the day allowed for it. A creek that ran through a narrow valley on the northwest edge of the property, fast and cold, and clear enough to read the bottom through it. A rise in the north country that gave a view across the whole of the ranch, and beyond it, the town of Clearwater as a small geometric arrangement in a vast organic landscape. The aspen grove on the upper eastern slope that his father had claimed as a thinking place, and that had passed down through inheritance of habit rather than instruction. They talked on these rides the way people talk when they are looking at the same thing from the same angle at the same time, which produces a different kind of conversation than facing each other across a table. He told her about the ranch's history the first years when his father had run cattle on borrowed land before acquiring enough of his own the drought of 1864 that had nearly ended the operation before it found its feet. The expansion that had come in the early 1870s when cattle prices were high and his father had worked 18-hour days for 3 consecutive years to take advantage of them. He asked her about what she had actually left behind, not what she had given up, but what she had loved about it. And she told him about the reading room at the Athenaeum in the early morning, about the particular acoustics of her father's lecture hall when it was full, about the way Boston Harbor smelled in October cold salt and rope, and the wooden smell of the wharves. "Do you miss it?" he asked. She considered honestly. "I miss my father," she said. "Boston was where he was. I don't think I miss the city itself. I think I miss the version of the world in which he was still in it." He did not offer comfort. He did not tell her it would become easier or that time would do its work. He simply received what she had said and let it be what it was, which was its own kind of courtesy, one she had not encountered often enough. Reed had told her during one of their book exchanges, conducted in the study on a rainy afternoon, that the aspen grove on the east slope was particularly worth seeing in October. "Ask him to take you when they turn," Reed had said. "He goes there himself every year. I don't think he goes with anyone." She had not said anything to that, but she had noted it. Wade observed the evening rides with the careful neutrality of a man who has strong opinions and is keeping them to himself for reasons he has decided are sufficient. He made no comment. He also, she noticed, began finding reasons to be present at supper more consistently than he had been in the first weeks, as though something about the current arrangement of the household required his regular attendance and assessment. Harold Preston came back on the third Saturday of her residence at 10 in the morning in his best vest. She opened the door before he had finished coming up the porch steps because she had seen him from the kitchen window and had made several decisions in the time it took him to cross the yard. He began with the town. He said the town was talking. He said the nature of the arrangement, a young unmarried woman residing with 3 unmarried men, was generating the kind of conversation that respectable communities found it necessary to have, and that as someone who had played a role in bringing this situation about, he felt a certain responsibility. He said that circumstances at his own household had changed in ways he had not anticipated, and that if she was willing to discuss a revised understanding, he thought that perhaps, given everything, it might still be possible for them to arrive at some satisfactory resolution. Clara stood in the doorway and listened to all of this with complete attention and complete stillness. Then she said, "Mr. Preston, you rejected me in front of this town on the day I arrived and paid for my removal. I made a decision based on what was available to me at the time you made yours. I am employed here under a written contract in a household that treats me with full respect, doing work that I do well and intend to continue doing. The town's conversation does not concern me. My reputation is intact because my conduct is intact. I do not have anything further to discuss with you." She closed the door. From the window of the study, she was almost certain she saw the curtain shift. She did not check. That evening, Ethan found her in the kitchen and stood at the counter with his coffee in a way that communicated he had something to say and was locating the appropriate words for it. "Harold isn't the kind of man who stops after one attempt," he said. "His self-regard is damaged. That makes him persistent in ways he might not otherwise be." "I know. Your position here doesn't depend on Harold Preston or anyone else who isn't you or me." "I know that too." He nodded. He finished his coffee. He set the cup down and was about to go when he stopped with the natural pause of a man who has remembered something. "You handled it well," he said. "I said what was true. That's generally the best way to handle things." The letter from Harold arrived on a Tuesday. Clara brought it in with the rest of the morning correspondence and left it on the desk in the study. That afternoon, passing the study door, she noticed the small fireplace in the corner had been lit, which was unusual for a warm day in June. She did not stop. At supper, she noticed Ethan was quieter than usual, the kind of quiet that is not the absence of things to say, but the presence of something being thought through carefully. Wade noticed, too, from the small sideways attention he deployed whenever the household dynamics required monitoring. Reed kept his eyes on his plate with the consideration of someone who suspects the cause and has decided not to involve himself. The following morning, before the brothers came down, Clara checked the small fireplace in the study. The ash in the grate held the ghost of a single sheet of paper burned completely. She went back to the kitchen and began the breakfast. At the table, Ethan sat down with his coffee and said without being asked, "Harold's letter, he suggested that if I encouraged you to return to town, the situation would simplify for everyone involved." She waited. "I should have shown it to you before I burned it. That was my decision to make, and it shouldn't have been." He looked at his cup. "You have the right to know what is being said about you and to you. I'll tell you going forward." What did he say exactly? That there were ways for a man of property to protect his interests and the interests of the people associated with him, and that the simplest one was to remove the complication. He paused. He was not specific about what protecting his interests meant. "I chose not to find out." "He'll try again." "He will, and when he does, it will be in a form he imagines I'll find harder to dismiss." His jaw was set in the particular way she had come to recognize as the physical expression of a decision already made. "Whatever form it takes, your situation here doesn't change." She looked at him. He was looking at his coffee. She said nothing because what needed to be said did not yet have the right language, and forcing it into inadequate words would diminish rather than communicate it. She went back to the biscuits, but she understood fully and without ambiguity what the burn letter meant. Harold Preston was preparing for something, and Ethan Calloway had already chosen which side of it he intended to stand on. The cattle went missing on a Friday at the end of the 7th week. Wade came back from a 3-day scout of the Eastern Range with information that arrived in the specific grounded way Wade delivered all information without alarm, without drama, organized into what was known, what was probable, and what remained to be determined. He had found signs of unfamiliar riders in the territory adjoining the East Pasture 2 days old, when he found them organized in the pattern of men moving with purpose rather than wandering. The East Pasture held 30 head of the ranch's most valuable breeding stock. Amos confirmed at first light the following morning. 30 head gone. Tracks leading south toward the lower valley moving slow. The way tracks move when the people making them are managing a herd they did not plan to manage quickly. Ethan assessed the information with the unhurried attention he brought to every problem worth solving. Then he looked at his brothers, looked at Amos, and began organizing. Clara brought coffee to the study, where the 4 of them were working over the maps. She set it on the table and sat down in the chair at the corner of the desk. 3 men looked at her briefly. Ethan looked at her for 1 beat longer, then returned to the map. She was in the room. That was all. Wade pointed out the geography. The tracks heading south would funnel through a narrow valley before they hit open ground. Moving slowly with 30 head of cattle, they could not be more than 12 or 15 miles out by now, which meant they were still catchable if the pursuit began within the next 2 hours. 7 men would ride. Amos would stay to hold the ranch. "How long?" Clara asked. "If things go well back by morning," Ethan said. "If not, tomorrow evening." She nodded. "I'll ask Vera to come." He looked at her once more. It was a brief look, but in it she read the acknowledgement of what she had not said, which was that she understood the situation fully, that she was not frightened in a way that would interfere with anything, and that she would manage the hours in between the way she managed everything. He said thank you and went to saddle his horse. Vera Whitaker arrived at the ranch before dusk with her knitting and the matter-of-fact composure of a woman who has spent many years in a territory where the men occasionally rode out after dark on necessary business and came back when the business was finished. She made tea. She sat in the kitchen. She and Clara moved through the evening hours in the comfortable parallel occupation of 2 women who do not need to perform distress to acknowledge that the situation has a weight to it. "He always comes back," Vera said at some point after 9. "I know," Clara said. 15 years I've known him. He has never not come back." She looked at her knitting without adding a stitch. "There was one time that was close. Winter of 73, a slide on the North Trail." She did not complete the story. She did not need to. "But he came back." Clara read by lamplight until the words stopped making sense, and then simply sat with her hands folded in her lap, listening to the ranch at night, which had its own language of small sounds that she had been learning for 7 weeks and could now partially translate. The wind in the ponderosa pines along the ridge, The horses in the near corral shifting and settling, the measured creak of the house adjusting to the temperature drop that came with the mountain dark. They came back at 3 in the morning. The sound of horses in the yard brought Clara to the kitchen window. She counted 7 riders in the dark before she identified Ethan at the front of the group, and something in her chest settled that had been very carefully not rising. He came through the back door. He was dusty and tired in the deep way that follows sustained physical effort and the particular tension of high-stakes pursuit. And behind him, 2 of the hands were walking with the careful gait of men working through minor injuries that they were not ready to classify as injuries yet. 30 had recovered, Ethan said. 2 of the rustlers are in county custody, the others scattered into the high country. He accepted the coffee she had ready without appearing to notice that she had known he would need it. Nobody dead. Coles took a cut on his forearm from a fence wire in the dark. Parks took a knock to the same shoulder we've been watching since his ankle injury. Sit down, she told Coles. I'll see to that cut before it closes around anything it shouldn't. She worked through the next 40 minutes without ceremony, cleaning and dressing Coles's forearm, assessing Parks's shoulder, determining that the knock was bruising rather than structural damage, doing what could be done at 3 in the morning with what was available and what she knew. The hands accepted this with the uncomplicated practicality of men who respect competence regardless of its origin. Ethan watched from the kitchen doorway. Vera left with Amos, who had come to collect her with the undemonstrative attentiveness of a man who has been doing considerate things for his wife for long enough that he no longer announces them. When the door closed behind them, the kitchen held only Ethan and Clara. He was moving normally. She had checked. Whatever the cattle recovery had cost him physically, he was carrying it without visible sign, and for 3 days she left it at that. The attack came 11 days later, and it came at night the way most serious things do. The men who had scattered into the high country when the rustlers were taken had apparently reconsidered their direction of travel. 3 of them, according to what Amos pieced together afterward from the tracks, had circled south and come back through the timber on the eastern edge of the property after dark, carrying the particular intentions of men who have suffered a loss and are prepared to make someone else suffer for it. The night watchman saw the torchlight near the near barn first. Clara was awake. She had not been sleeping well since the night Ethan came back from the cattle recovery and said things in the kitchen doorway about finding it again when there was time to say it properly, and the particular quality of wakefulness that produced was different from ordinary sleeplessness. She heard the watchman shout. She heard the horses. She heard Ethan's voice from somewhere in the yard carrying the specific authority it carried in emergencies, and she understood immediately what the sounds organized into. She did not go to the window to watch. She went to the kitchen. The shotgun was where it had always been, on the rack beside the pantry door, loaded, as Ethan kept everything that might be needed quickly. She had confirmed this in the first week without being asked to, and had not mentioned it to anyone. She took it down. She checked it the way her father's hunting friend had shown her when she was 17 and visiting the family's summer property in Maine, on the grounds that the daughter of any house should know where the weapons were and what to do with them. She had not touched a firearm since. The knowledge came back in the way that physical knowledge returns through the hands rather than through the mind. She positioned herself at the kitchen window that looked out over the yard, her back to the wall, the shotgun at a low angle, and she watched. What she could see was limited and alarming, lanterns moving at wrong angles. The near barn not yet burning in the torchlight apparently intercepted before it found purchase on the drywood. Men's voices in the dark, organized versus not organized, and she could tell without seeing which was which. The sound of one shot, then 2 more from a different direction, which she understood as Wade coming from outside the perimeter. Then a period of confused close-quarter noise that she could not parse from her position, and then a long interval of silence that was worse than the noise. She stood at the window for 40 minutes. She did not move from the wall. When Ethan came through the kitchen door, he stopped. She was exactly where she had decided to be. The shotgun was at the low carry she had adopted for the duration, and she had not put it down because no one had told her the situation was finished, and she did not operate on assumptions. He took in the entirety of this in the time it took him to close the door behind him. "Is it done?" she asked. "It's done. 2 of them ran. 1 is staying with Amos until the sheriff comes." He was looking at her with the expression she had learned to recognize as the expression of a man in the process of revising something he thought he had fully understood. Are you all right? Yes. She set the gun down on the kitchen table, the barrel pointed at the wall. You're moving carefully. Took a hit coming around the far corral. He paused. It's not serious. Sit down, she said. Let me see. He looked at her, then he sat down. She went to the shelf where she kept the arnica she had acquired in the first week. She came back to the table. He lifted his shirt on the left side, and the bruise that ran from his lower ribs down toward his hip was the deep purple red of a blow taken recently and not attended to. She sat down beside him and began working the salve into the bruised area with the careful attention the injury required. The kitchen was quiet. The lamp on the table cast its warm, bounded light. Outside, the Wyoming night was enormous and full of its own sounds, and the mountains were present in the darkness, the way mountains are always present, whether visible or not. Ethan was looking at the wall. After a while, he said, I had a family here once. She continued working. She did not respond because he was not speaking to fill silence. He was speaking because something in the hour, in the quiet, in the particular quality of the moment had opened something that generally stayed close. Eleanor, he said, my wife and a son, James. He was quiet for a moment that held a great deal. Winter of '75. The birth went wrong. I rode 40 miles for Doc Greer in a blizzard. He paused. I got back 2 hours late. She did not say she was sorry. The conventional comfort of those words would have collapsed the weight of what he had just said into something manageable and ordinary, and it was neither of those things. She acknowledged it by receiving it fully, by not flinching from it, or redirecting away from it, by letting it be as large as it was. I know, she said after a moment. He looked at her. The photograph, she said, between the survey maps in the study, it fell when I was cleaning and I caught it before it reached the floor. She met his eyes steadily. I put it back where it was. I didn't say anything because it wasn't my place to raise it. That was your information to share or not share. He was quiet for a long time. The lamp burned without variation. Her hands continued their careful work along the edge of the bruise. I built this ranch for a family, he said finally. When the family was gone, the ranch was still here, so I kept building it. I didn't know what else to do. He looked at the wall again. Some mornings you have to make yourself look at the fence line instead of other things. And then the fence line leads to the next thing, and eventually the day is over and you have gotten through it. She finished with the arnica and sat back. The house has been coming back to itself, he said. It was a shift in registered, deliberate pulling back from the deep water to something more bearable. I notice it every time I come in. It's different from what it's been. The house was well made, she said. It only needed attention. He looked at her then with the amber eyes that she had been learning to read for 7 weeks, and that she now read in this particular combination of lamplight and late hour, and everything that had just passed between them, with the particular clarity of someone seeing something they have been aware of for some time and are only now willing to name. He was about to say something. The back door opened. Wade came in from the barn with the ease of a man who has completed a final check and is ready to call the night finished, and stopped when he registered the configuration of the kitchen and said with a sincerity that was itself a kind of tact, Sorry, needed to get something. He got something from the shelf near the door, which was almost certainly not what he had come for, and went back out. The moment had closed. Ethan stood. He moved with more care than before the arnica and less pain, which was what arnica was for. Get some sleep, he said. It's been a long day for everyone. Go carefully on those stairs, she said, and don't lie on your left side. He paused at the door with his back to her. Then he said, What I was going to say. It's not finished. I'll say it when there's a proper time for it. I'll be here, she said. He went up the stairs. She heard his door at the end of the hall. She sat at the kitchen table for a while with the lamp burning low and the arnica and the supplies she would pack away in the morning and the photograph she had never asked him about and the words he had said and the words he had not yet said. She thought about a man who rides 40 miles in a blizzard and arrives 2 hours late. She thought about fence lines and the function of daily work when the purpose of it has been removed. She thought about what it means to keep building something when you no longer know what you are building it for. She was still thinking about it when she went upstairs, and it followed her into the quiet of her room, in the darkness beyond the window, where the mountains were present, though not visible, as they always were. 2 weeks after the cattle recovery on a Saturday evening, when Clara had thought the day was finished, Harold Preston rode into the yard. He brought no hired men this time. He came alone in his good vest with the diminished authority of a man who has tried one approach and is attempting to locate another. But he also came with the specific stubbornness of someone whose wounded self-regard has had sufficient time to calcify into something more like resolution. He did not get to the porch steps. All three Calloway brothers were in the yard when he arrived, not assembled in anticipation of him specifically. Ethan had been coming from the barn. Wade had been coming from the corral. Reed had emerged from the house with a book he had apparently decided to read on the porch in the evening air. The convergence was coincidental in its geography, and not coincidental in anything else. Harold looked at the three of them arranged between him and the house. He looked at the specific quality of stillness that Ethan had not moved from since he became aware of the approaching rider. He looked at Wade, who stood with his weight slightly shifted and his hands at a comfortable position near his belt that communicated several things without words. He looked at Reed, who was holding his book without opening it, watching with the patient curiosity of someone observing a situation he intends to understand fully. Harold said nothing for a long moment. Then he turned his horse around and rode back toward town. Nobody in the yard spoke. Amos, from the fence rail where he had been sitting with his coffee, made no comment. The horses in the corral made their usual sounds. The evening moved toward dusk, as it intended to regardless. Ethan found Clara in the kitchen that evening and stood at the counter in the position she had come to recognize as his position when something needed to be said. "Harold won't come back," he said. "Not to the ranch. He's run out of approaches. He'll find another angle. Maybe, but whatever it is, it won't be one where he can look you in the face and make a demand." He was quiet for a moment. "What I was going to say in the kitchen after the attack, I need to say it properly. There's a place on the property I want to show you this weekend. A full afternoon if you can spare it." She looked at him. "I can spare it," she said. He nodded. He left the kitchen. She stood at the counter after he was gone and looked out the window at the mountains in the last of the evening light, their upper slopes still holding the gold of the sun, while everything below had gone into the blue of coming darkness. The Wind River peaks were patient and enormous, and entirely indifferent to the specific arrangements of the small creatures living in the valley below them. She found, as she had found from the beginning, that this indifference was not cold. It was simply honest. The mountains did not require her story to make sense. They had been here long before the story started, and they would be here long after it was resolved one way or another. Whatever was going to happen this weekend, and she knew by now enough about Ethan Calloway to know approximately what shape it was going to take, would happen under mountains that had seen every version of it before and would see every version of it again. She went to check on the bread she had left rising. The house was warm, and the evening was large, and the weekend was coming, and she had work enough to fill the time between now and then, which was exactly what she needed. The town of Clearwater had its own way of processing information. It was not a cruel town, nor a particularly small-minded one, as frontier towns went. It was simply a community of approximately 300 people living in a contained geography, which meant that the arrival and departure of significant events moved through it the way weather moved through the valley, touching everything before it finished. Harold Preston's 2 visits to the Calloway Ranch and his 2 wordless returns to town had been observed and noted and discussed with the thoroughness that communities apply to situations that offer them both moral clarity and dramatic satisfaction at the same time. People saw Harold Preston in the street with new eyes now, not hostile ones, something more uncomfortable than hostility, which was the particular mild pity reserved for a man who has revealed himself to be smaller than his position suggested he was, and who must now continue to occupy that position with everyone aware of the discrepancy. He moved through Clearwater with the careful efficiency of someone who has reduced his exposure to public spaces without making an announcement about it. He opened his store at the usual hour and closed it at the usual hour and conducted his commerce with professional adequacy and very little else. Margaret Holt found Clara after the Sunday service at the end of the 8th week and walked with her toward the wagon with the directness that Clara had come to recognize as Margaret's default register. The whole town saw him come back twice and leave twice without saying anything worth saying, Margaret said. There is a settled feeling about your situation now that wasn't there before. People have made up their minds. In which direction? In the direction of any woman who can stand in the Calloway yard with those 3 men behind her and send Harold Preston home without a scene. Margaret looked at her sideways. You may not know this, but that yard has a certain reputation. Men who come to that yard with the wrong intentions have a documented history of reconsidering them. Clara said nothing to this, which Margaret appeared to interpret as the most interesting possible response. Dorothea Preston came to the ranch on a Wednesday afternoon without announcement. She was a compact, well-organized woman in her middle 50s who moved with the efficiency of someone accustomed to running things and prepared to run whatever room she entered. She knocked at the front door rather than the back, which Clara noted as a social decision rather than a practical one. She was shown into the sitting room. She sat in the chair that Ethan sometimes occupied in the evenings, which she could not have known, and which was therefore simply the chair she chose. She did not come with the manner of someone paying a social call. I arrived in Clearwater, she said, and I arranged myself in my brother's house without consulting him or anyone else, and this caused a specific harm to a specific person. I am aware of that. She paused. I did not come here intending harm. I came because Harold needed managing, and I am the person in the family who manages things. I did not consider that the need I was meeting in one place was creating a need somewhere else. Clara sat in the chair across from her and listened to all of this with the full attention she gave to things that deserved it. I am not asking you to forgive an inconvenience, Dorothea continued. What happened to you was not an inconvenience. You reorganized your life around an arrangement that was then removed without adequate notice or consideration. That is a serious harm. She placed both hands on her knees. I am saying so clearly because I believe it should be said clearly. Clara looked at this woman who had come to her door on a Wednesday without announcement because she had something to say and had decided to say it. Thank you, Clara said. That required something of you. Less than it should have required, Dorothea said. That is also something I am prepared to acknowledge. They did not become friends that afternoon. They were too different in constitution and too recently on opposite sides of a significant event for friendship to have any honest basis yet. But they looked at each other with the clear mutual recognition of 2 practical women who have each done what their respective situation required of them and can respect that quality in the other, regardless of anything else. When Dorothea left, she walked back through town with the same upright efficiency she always walked with, and the people who saw her go did not know what had been said in that sitting room. But the fact that she had gone and gone alone and come back without her brother and carried herself afterward with the particular quality of a person who has discharged an obligation, she set for herself communicated something to the watching community that language would have been clumsy in conveying. Harold Preston closed his store on a Thursday 2 weeks later and did not reopen it for 4 days, which was unprecedented in 11 years of operation. When it reopened, it operated normally. Harold was behind the counter. He acknowledged customers with professional courtesy. He did not cross the street when he saw the Calloway wagon in town. He did not seek out Clara when she came in for supplies, but neither did he make any further approaches. He had arrived apparently at the condition of a man who has processed his situation and accepted its dimensions and was now simply living inside them. It was not a dramatic resolution. The best ones rarely are. The morning Wade said what needed to be said was a Thursday in early July, cloudless and warm, even at altitude, the kind of Wyoming summer morning that makes the preceding winter seem like a story someone else told, rather than something you personally survived. Clara was working the kitchen garden, which by that point in her tenure had become a productive rather than theoretical operation with rows of carrots and beans and turnips advancing in the organized way of things that have been given consistent attention. She heard Wade come across the yard and find the fence rail at the garden's edge and lean against it in the position that meant he had something on his mind and was taking his time approaching it. She worked, he leaned. The morning went about its business. Ethan hasn't really been alive since the winter of '75, he said eventually. She sat back on her heels and looked at him. I don't mean that as a figure of speech, he said. I mean, he has been doing everything correctly. Running the ranch, making decisions, managing the land and the cattle and the men. Everything that needs doing, he does it well. But there's a thing that was in him before that winter that I have not seen in him since. He was looking past her at the middle distance, at something she could not locate but recognized by the quality of his gaze as something specific to him rather than general to the landscape. I have seen it in the last 8 weeks. It is coming back. She did not respond immediately. The garden held its patient green rose. I am telling you this, he said, not because I need you to do anything with it or because I am asking you for anything. I am telling you because Ethan won't tell you. Not because it isn't true, because he doesn't know yet how to say it, and he wouldn't say it about himself regardless. He picked up a piece of fence rail and turned it in his hands. He is a man who shows things by doing them. You have to know how to read the doing. She looked at him steadily. Wade Calloway, who read everything and filed everything and said only what he decided needed saying, standing at her garden fence on a Thursday morning in July, telling her something he had apparently decided she needed to know. I know how to read it, she said. He looked at her then. That amber gaze with its quality of constant underneath-the-surface movement, assessing and processing at a speed his casual exterior was designed to obscure. He held her eyes for one measured moment. Good, he said. He set the piece of rail down and pushed off the fence and went back across the yard toward the corrals, and the conversation ended the way Wade's significant conversations tended to end, without ceremony or follow-up, complete in itself and requiring nothing further. She stayed in the garden for a while after he was gone. The carrots were coming well. The beans would need staking before the end of the week. The morning light on the mountain faces to the west had the particular quality of high summer that makes everything look more permanent than it is, which is not the worst illusion to live inside for a while. On the Saturday of that same week, Ethan appeared at the kitchen door in the early afternoon and said he wanted to show her a part of the property she had not yet seen. He said it would take the rest of the afternoon. He had already saddled the horses. She took off her apron. They rode north and then east along a trail that climbed steadily through open country before entering a section of mixed timber that she had seen from a distance on several of their previous rides but not approached. The ponderosa gave way to aspen as the trail continued upward, the white trunks appearing in increasing numbers until the forest around them was almost entirely aspen, the leaves catching and releasing the afternoon light with the particular restlessness that belongs to aspen alone, as though each leaf is making an individual decision about the wind. Ethan rode slightly ahead on the narrower sections and beside her where the trail allowed it and said nothing, which did not feel like the absence of communication. It felt like the presence of a different kind of it, the kind that does not use language. The trail crested a rise and the view opened to the east and south, and clear water was visible in the valley below a small geometric arrangement of streets and buildings, and the church steeple that rose above everything else, the whole of it so contained from this height that it looked like a thing that could be held in two hands. Beyond the town, the valley extended in both directions, and the ranch was visible, all of it from here, the main house and the barns and the corrals, and the network of fence lines that marked the property in its organized complexity. She had not seen the ranch from this angle before. It looked different from above, more intentional, the way things look when you can see the whole of them rather than the part you are standing in. Ethan dismounted. She dismounted. They stood at the edge of the ridge with the view spread out below them. And then she saw it. Through a stand of aspen to the east of where they stood, not fully visible, but visible enough, a structure was taking shape. Walls of squared timber, newer and lighter in color than the seasoned wood of the main house. A roof line partially completed the geometry of it, deliberate. Two window openings cut into the south-facing wall to capture the light. A porch foundation along the front elevation, its proportions suggesting something substantial enough to sit in during the evening. It was not finished. It was far enough along to understand what it was going to be. How long, she said. 6 weeks, he said. She was quiet, looking at it through the aspen. The leaves moved around it with their characteristic silver-green motion, framing it and releasing it in the shifting light. I have been trying to say something since the night of the attack, he said. He was standing beside her, not looking at her, but at the structure through the trees, and his voice had the quality of a man committing to a statement he has been forming for some time and is now releasing in its final version. I have started it several times and been interrupted or pulled it back because the moment wasn't right or I hadn't found the correct way in. I am going to say it now without waiting for it to be perfect because I am beginning to understand that the perfect version of it does not exist, and this one is sufficient. She waited. I built everything on this ranch with a purpose in mind, a family, a life that had people in it beyond the work itself. He paused in the way of someone taking care with the territory they are moving into. When Eleanor and the boy died, I kept building because there was nothing else available to me that made sense. The building was still here. The land was still here. I understood how to do those things even when I understood very little else. He was quiet for a moment. I did not know until recently that what I was building was waiting for something to make it worth what it cost. The aspen leaves said what they always said. The view below held its patience. You have made this place into what I always meant it to be, he said. Not by being the woman I imagined when I imagined such a person. By being entirely different from anything I imagined. By knowing things I didn't expect you to know, and doing things I didn't anticipate, and refusing every situation that tried to make you smaller than you are. He turned to look at her then, and the amber eyes in the afternoon light held everything she had been reading in them for 8 weeks, unguarded now and completely present. I am not asking you to stay because the ranch needs a housekeeper. I am asking you to stay because I do not want to look at this view 10 years from now without you beside me when I look at it. She looked at the structure through the aspen. She looked at the valley below. She looked at the mountains behind everything, the Wind River Range in its eternal patient removal from all human affairs, holding its position as it had held it since before any of this was here, and would hold it long after. She thought about a reading room in Boston in the early morning with light coming through high windows onto tables where the serious and the curious and the lonely came to be briefly in the presence of everything written down. She thought about her father's voice in a lecture hall, making Dickens and Shakespeare and the whole of the English literary tradition feel like personal correspondence rather than inherited furniture. She thought about a platform in Clearwater and a boy with an oversized hat and a man in a mercantile who had looked at her and seen someone worth the intervention. She thought about Eleanor and James, a photograph between 2 survey maps, 2 words written in careful handwriting by a man who had kept building when there was nothing left to build toward. I came to Wyoming to marry a stranger, she said. I came because I had no other options, and I was trying to make something workable out of a situation that had no good solutions. She looked at him. That is not why I would stay. He waited. I would stay because this land is the most honest place I have ever stood in, she said. Because the work here is real work with real results. Because there are books in that study with a dead woman's name in them, and 3 sizes of childish handwriting in the margins, and I have read every one of them, and they are good books, and I would like to finish the conversation they began. She paused. And because you are the only person I have met in my adult life who tells me the truth about everything, and expects the same from me, which is rarer than it should be, and worth more than you appear to know. He reached into his coat pocket and produced a small velvet box of the kind that carries its own significance in the shape of it before it is even open. Inside, on a backing of worn cloth, a ring, a gold band set with 2 amber stones flanking a central diamond, the amber the color of good creek water in low autumn light. My mother's, he said. She wore it for 31 years. She said the stones were the color of my father's eyes in the afternoon. He placed it on her finger. It fit with the specific accuracy of something that has been fitted for its purpose, and she looked at it for a moment against the context of the aspen and the mountain light and the whole improbable sequence of events that had produced this afternoon. Tomorrow, he said, I will place it there again in front of everyone who should see it. But tonight I wanted a moment that was only ours. She looked up at him. He was watching her with the face she had seen in the photograph, the one that existed before the winter of '75 taught him to cover it over. Open and present and not at all managing itself. She told him yes, not in a speech, in that single word which was sufficient. He put both hands on either side of her face, which was large and careful and warm from the sun of a Wyoming July, and he lowered his head, and the first time he kissed her was in an aspen grove in the high country of the ranch he had built for a future, with the amber stones of his mother's ring on her finger, and the Wind River peaks in the distance, holding their eternal and indifferent positions. The afternoon light held everything in gold. Ethan made his announcement at supper that evening with the directness he applied to all information he considered important and not requiring embellishment. "I asked Clara to marry me," he said, and he did not make it a question by inflecting it as one or by framing it with any particular expectation of response. He stated it as the fact it was. She said, "Yes, we will be married when the house on the east slope has its roof on." Wade set his fork down. He set it down with the careful precision of a man who is doing one physical thing in order to manage the more complex internal situation that the announcement has just produced. Then he picked it up again. "Good," he said, and then, after a pause of exactly the right length, "about time." He returned to his supper, but she saw in the moment before he looked back at his plate something move across his face that was not quite what it appeared to be on the surface, a recognition that he absorbed and processed and filed in the place where men like Wade Calloway file the things they have decided not to examine too closely in the light. He had told her what she needed to know in the garden that Thursday morning. He had said what he had decided needed saying, and he had meant every word of it. What he was managing now was his own business, and he was managing it with the self-possession she had come to expect from him, which meant he would manage it privately and completely, and no one would be asked to account for it. Reed set his pen down on his journal. He had been making a note when the announcement was delivered, as he often was recording the day's developments in the running account he maintained of the life of this place. He looked at the table for a moment, then at Clara with the expression of someone who has been carrying something for some time and feels it become, if not lighter, at least differently distributed. "I am glad you stayed," he said. "I know what I was part of in bringing you here, and I know what it cost. I am glad that what followed was worth the cost." He paused. "And I would like, if I may, to contribute whatever books seem appropriate to the library of the new house, as a starting collection." Clara looked at him across the table. Reed Calloway, who had written 11 letters in another man's name and answered them with his own honest intelligence, and had arrived at the train station on the day she got off, and had gone still in a particular way that she now understood completely. "I would like that very much," she said. The roof went on in 9 days. Every hand on the ranch volunteered hours on the project, without being asked. Working in the early mornings before the heat of the day made the work uncomfortable, and in the late afternoons when the light was still good. They worked with the focused, cooperative efficiency of men who do good work, when the reason for it is clear to them, and the reason was clear to all of them. 3 weeks after the proposal on the ridge, a letter arrived at the ranch addressed to Clara, postmarked from Boston, from the office of a solicitor whose name she did not immediately recognize. She read it at the kitchen table in the early morning before anyone else came down. A distant relative, a cousin of her father's, she had met twice in her childhood and not thought of since, had died in the spring and left a portion of his modest estate to the family members. He had maintained any awareness of which included Clara, by virtue of a single letter she had written him when she was 14, and her father had required all family correspondence to be completed before the Christmas holiday. The portion she had inherited came to $250. She read the letter twice. She set it on the table. She looked out the kitchen window at the garden, which was in full summer production. Now the carrot tops dense and the bean poles properly staked, the whole of it organized and alive in the morning light. Reed came downstairs at 6 with his journal. She slid the letter across the table to him without comment. He read it. He set it down. He looked at her with the particular quality of patience that characterized his attention when he was waiting for something to complete itself. "Does Clearwater have a library?" she asked. The expression that moved across Reed Calloway's face in the moment that followed was one she had not seen on him before. It began in his eyes and reached his mouth, and it was not the careful, partial smile he deployed in social situations, but the full, unguarded version of the thing, the smile of a man who has been given information that reorganizes several things at once and finds the reorganization genuinely good. "Not yet," he said. $250 is a starting collection, she said, and the books from your mother's study if the family is willing. The family, Reed said, is more than willing. He picked up his pen and opened his journal and wrote for several minutes without stopping. And she understood that she was watching the founding of the Clearwater Library being recorded in the handwriting that had once written to her about the quality of starlight at altitude, which was perhaps the most appropriate historiography it could have. The night before the wedding, Ethan knocked at her bedroom door in the main house at 9 o'clock. She had been packing the last of her belongings for the move to the new house. The house on the east slope where the aspen had grown up around it, and the windows faced south and west to catch all available light. The bedroom in the main house, which had been the housekeeper's room, and then her room, and was now in the process of becoming a guest room in the traditional fashion of rooms that outlast the purposes assigned to them, held the last of her things in a traveling bag that looked different from the one she had carried off the train in May. The same bag worn in slightly different places from the particular geography of this life. Ethan stood at the threshold in the careful way of a man who respects the sovereignty of a room that is not his. "I have something for you before tomorrow," he said. He held a second box smaller than the first, different in shape. Inside it was a ring of plain gold, a band without stones, simple and solid in the way of something made to last rather than to impress. "The engagement ring was my mother's," he said. "This one I had made. I asked the jeweler in Clearwater to make it plain because I wanted something that was ours specifically, not passed down from what came before. Something we begin with rather than continue." She looked at the two rings together in the lamplight, the amber-stoned one already on her hand and this new plain one resting in its small box. Something that was theirs specifically. Something they begin with. "Tomorrow in front of everyone I will place it beside the other one," he said. "But tonight I wanted to give it to you in a quiet moment without the occasion around it." She took it from the box. She held it. The gold was warm even from its brief time in his pocket, carrying a small residue of the warmth of the man who had been holding it on the ride down from the new house to the main house in the cooling September evening. "Ethan," she said. He waited. "You have done more than you know," she said. "From the first day, from the mercantile. You have done more than any situation required of you, and you have done it without making it into something you are owed for." She looked at him. "I want you to know that I see it, all of it." He stood in the doorway for a moment with the look she had come to know as the look of a man receiving something he does not know how to respond to because he has not built the appropriate architecture for receiving it, only for giving it. "Go to sleep," he said finally. "Morning comes early." "I know," she said. "I am always the first one up." "I know," he said. And there was something in how he said it that was its own kind of thing. He touched the brim of his hat, which he was still wearing inside the house, which was a habit she had decided she was not going to try to change, and he went back down the hall. She closed her door and sat on the edge of the bed and held the plain gold ring in her palm. Through the window, the sky above the mountains was full of stars, the particular Wyoming density of them that she had been reading about in the letter since last winter, and had been living beneath since May, and still found on certain evenings quietly astonishing. The wedding morning came in cold and clear, the particular clarity of September at altitude that makes everything look slightly more precise than it ordinarily does, as though the world has been recently edited for accuracy. The aspen on the east slope were not yet at their full autumn color, but were moving toward it, the leaves beginning their turn from summer green to the particular yellow gold that would arrive fully in October. Enough of the gold was already visible to give the hillside around the new house a quality of brightness that the morning light amplified. Vera Whitaker and Margaret Holt came to the new house at first light and helped Clara into the dress that had been ordered from Denver 3 weeks earlier when the date was set. It was cream-colored silk with lace at the collar and cuffs, the kind of dress that required the judgment of someone who knew the woman wearing it. And she had made those decisions herself with the knowledge that what she wanted was not elaborate but was precise. Margaret contributed a length of lace from her own mother's things, this serving as the something borrowed that tradition requires and sentiment makes meaningful. Through the window of the bedroom, which faced west over the slope toward the main house and the ranch buildings below, Clara could see the yard filling with guests. Ranch hands in their carefully maintained Sunday clothes. People from town arriving in wagons and on horseback, the community of Clearwater coming up the trail to the east slope in the informal but genuine procession of neighbors gathering for something that matters. Tables had been set up under the aspen, and whatever the September morning lacked in full autumn color, it supplied in quality of light, the angle of it, through the turning leaves producing the gold-dappled illumination that photographers spend careers trying to replicate artificially, and that occurs in nature without effort for a few weeks each year in places where aspen grow. Ready? Vera asked. Clara looked at herself in the small mirror propped against the wall. She was wearing a ring on her left hand that had come from a woman named Catherine Calloway, who had taught school before marrying into this land, and she was about to place beside it a plain gold band that represented something beginning rather than something continuing. And both of those things were true simultaneously, which she had come to understand was not a contradiction. Yes, she said. Reed was waiting at the door. He offered his arm with the formality of a man who understands the weight of what he has been asked to do and intends to carry it properly. She took it. They walked from the house down the slope toward the gathering through the aspen, and the leaves moved around them with their particular silver-gold restlessness, and the light came through in the fractured, beautiful way of light, through aspen canopy, and the whole of the ranch was visible below them. Ethan stood at the end of the aisle that the gathered guests had formed by standing on either side of the space between the aspen rows. He wore a dark suit that was clearly new and had been fitted by someone who understood that the proportions of a man built the way Ethan Calloway was built require particular attention. He had left his hat off entirely, which she had never seen before in any ordinary circumstance, and his auburn hair was as tamed as it was ever going to be in this life. He looked at her when she came through the aspen. He looked at her with his face as completely open as it was in the photograph between the survey maps, the face that had been covered and was now available again, and the amber eyes held everything she had been reading in them for 8 weeks of careful attention. The minister from Clearwater read the service in the clean carrying voice of a man accustomed to speaking outdoors in mountain country, where the wind moves unpredictably and the congregation is scattered, and the words need to reach everyone, regardless of position. The aspen leaves added their commentary. The mountains did what they always did. When the vows were spoken, they were spoken clearly in the voices of two people who have thought carefully about the words they are saying and mean each one of them with the specific knowledge of what the other person has cost them and what they have been worth. Ethan placed the plain gold band beside the amber stone ring on her finger, and Clara looked down at both rings together, the inherited one and the new one, and felt the weight of them as the particular weight of something that is real. The minister said the words that completed it. Ethan kissed her with the brief, careful restraint of a man who is aware that 40 people are watching and who will address the larger version of this later in the privacy appropriate to it. The gathered community of Clearwater, Wyoming territory expressed its approval in the various ways that communities express approval at weddings, which involve considerable noise and considerable generosity. Wade, who had been standing at Ethan's shoulder throughout the ceremony with his hat in his hand and his face arranged in the expression of a man attending a significant event and intending to comport himself appropriately, made a sound when the kiss was completed. It was not quite a cheer and not quite anything else. It was the sound of a man who has been managing something internally for some time and has finally arrived at the moment where the management is complete. The celebration moved into the afternoon with the momentum of genuine community rather than obligatory festivity. The women of Clearwater had organized the food with the collaborative thoroughness of people who understand that a proper occasion requires proper attention, and the tables under the aspen held the accumulated results of many kitchens engaged in friendly competition with one another. The ranch hands ate with the uncomplicated enthusiasm of working men given a legitimate reason to stop working. The fiddle player from the saloon pressed into more respectable service for the afternoon, produced music that the open air of the mountain slope received and amplified. She danced with Reed first. They had not discussed this, but it was understood. They danced the way two people dance who are in the habit of conducting their most interesting conversations in unlikely locations. And the conversation this time was about Dickens, specifically about whether Dickens would have had anything useful to say about Wyoming territory. And Reed's position was that Dickens would have found the material irresistible and produced something entirely accurate about it and also entirely wrong. And Clara's position was that this was the most precise description of Dickens she had ever heard. She danced with Wade's second. He danced with the ease of a man who has done most things enough times to have found the efficient version of them. He did not say anything for most of the dance, and the silence between them was the silence of people who have said what needed to be said and are comfortable on the other side of having said it. At the end of the song, he said, "Welcome to the family, Clara Calloway. We are a peculiar group, but we do not leave people behind." She said, "I know. That is among the reasons I stayed." He let her go with the particular deliberateness of a man who has decided something completely and is acting on the decision without any remaining ambiguity, and went to find someone to discuss horse breeding with, which was something Wade Calloway could discuss at length at any occasion without it seeming inappropriate. She danced with Ethan last because that was the correct order of things, and they danced until the light was gone, and the lanterns that had been hung in the aspen branches earlier in the day became the primary illumination, golden and gentle and sufficient. The way light is sufficient when the quality of what it illuminates is good. The guests departed in the gradual way of people who are enjoying themselves and are reluctant to let the occasion conclude. Amos and Vera were among the last. Vera embracing Clara with the wordless warmth of a woman who has been watching and waiting for exactly this, and finds the actual arrival of it more satisfying than she had allowed herself to anticipate. Amos shook Ethan's hand in the way of men who have known each other long enough that the handshake carries 30 years of context in it. The door of the new house closed behind the last of them. Ethan turned from the door. The new house held the warmth of a fire that had been lit earlier by someone who had thought ahead, and the lamplight and the particular quality of a space that has been built for a specific life and is now receiving it. He crossed the room to where she stood. That night, the new house on the east slope of the Calloway Ranch became what it had always been intended to be. When morning came, everything that had been in the process of becoming was complete. October of 1888, 10 years into their marriage. The aspen on the east slope were at their peak, the color so complete and so saturated that it was visible from the main house below, and from the road to Clearwater, and from the upper trail that wound north toward the high country. A beacon of gold burning on the hillside, with the annual extravagance of a thing that does not hold back simply because it will have to do the same again next year. The house had been expanded twice since the wedding. It was now a substantial structure with rooms that had grown to accommodate the life that filled them. The library that Reed and Clara had designed together occupied the eastern end of the ground floor, and it held by Clara's most recent count 431 volumes. Some of them the original collection of Catherine Calloway, and many of them ordered from the bookseller in Denver, who had by that point been supplying the Calloway family with reading material for long enough to have developed a reliable sense of their collective taste. The Clearwater Library had opened in the spring of 1881 in a room above the hardware store that the community had repurposed for the purpose funded by the $250 of Clara's inheritance, the matching contribution from the ranch, and a subsequent campaign conducted by Margaret Holt that had brought in additional funds from donors as far away as Cheyenne. It now occupied its own building, the first purpose-built library in the county, and served every child in the Clearwater School District with the resources that Margaret Holt had been trying to provide without adequate resources for the entirety of her tenure. Clara had served on the library's board since its founding and had taught 2 days a week at the school for 3 years before the demands of the ranch and the children required a renegotiation of her time. Thomas was 8. He had Ethan's coloring and Clara's specific quality of attention, and he was currently in the lower corral, learning to manage the roan pony that had been his birthday gift in the spring. Ethan was in the corral with him, not doing the managing, but available at the edges of it, in the way of a man who understands that the lesson is not the same lesson if he intervenes too readily. Thomas was having a conversation with the pony that appeared to be going poorly for Thomas, and Ethan was watching this conversation with the particular patience of a man who has seen a great deal of negotiation between humans and horses and knows which party usually arrives at wisdom first. Eleanor was 6. She had her mother's honey-colored hair and her father's amber eyes in the specific combination of both of their stubbornness, which was considerable when taken individually and formidable when combined in the same small person. She was currently in the ranch library with Reed, who was teaching her the names of the Wyoming mountain ranges in their proper geological context, because Eleanor had asked him why the mountains were there, And Reed had taken the question seriously enough to produce an answer that required maps and a great deal of explanation and had been going on at intervals for several weeks. Wade came to the ranch for Christmas and for the midsummer gather, and sometimes for no articulable reason at all, which was how it had always been with Wade and how it was going to continue to be. The children loved him with the specific intensity that children reserve for the family member who tells them the most interesting stories, and is reliably present at the most exciting moments, and is reliably absent during the duller intervals of ordinary life. He had shown no particular inclination to replicate the domestic arrangement of his brothers, and no one pressed him on it because Wade Calloway was going to arrive at whatever he arrived at by whatever route he chose, and the people who knew him well understood that the route was at least as important to him as the destination. Amos had retired in the spring of that year, and he and Vera had a house in Clearwater where they lived within visiting distance of the ranch, which Amos supplemented by appearing at the property several times a week to assess fence conditions and offer opinions about the operation that were not requested, but were generally correct. Harold Preston had sold the mercantile in 1884 and moved to Cheyenne without ceremony. The store was run now by a young couple named Weston, who had come from Illinois and who conducted their commerce with the friendly efficiency of people who have not yet had occasion to let anyone down in their current community. Dorothea had stayed in Clearwater, having found in the town a scale of life that suited her organizational capacities, and had established herself as a figure of some consequence in the community's institutional life. She and Clara had developed over the years the relationship of two people who respect each other's competence and have buried between them in the deep compost of time and conduct whatever required burial. Clara stood on the porch of the house on the east slope on an October evening in 1888, with a cup of coffee she had been intending to drink for the past 20 minutes, but had been too occupied with watching the light to attend to. The aspen were at their fullest gold. Below the slope, the ranch operations of the afternoon were concluding in the familiar patterns she could read from this distance without needing to see the details. In the lower corral, Ethan was lifting Thomas down from the pony with the careful competence of a man who has done this in one form or another his whole life. Thomas's posture suggested a negotiation that had not gone entirely in his favor, which was useful information for him at this stage of his education. From the library at the east end of the house, she could hear Eleanor's voice asking Reed something, and Reed's voice answering it with the fullness of attention he brought to everything Eleanor asked him, which had produced in Eleanor the understanding that her questions were worth asking and her curiosity was worth following, which was among the most important things a 6-year-old could learn about herself. Ethan looked up from the corral. He saw her on the porch. He raised one hand briefly, a gesture without category, not a wave, not a signal, simply an acknowledgement across the space between them. She raised her cup in return. He said something to Thomas, and Thomas went off in the direction of the barn with the purposeful gait of a boy who has been given a task to complete and intends to complete it before dark. Ethan came up the slope. He came onto the porch and stood beside her and looked at the mountains. The Wind River peaks were doing what they did in October, wearing the last of their autumn light in the particular amber that the low-angle sun produces at this time of year, the color of the stones in the ring on her finger, the color of his eyes in any light that showed them truly. Any regrets, he said. He said it the way he said all the significant things plainly in the voice he reserved for things that deserve plainness. She looked at the mountains, at the ranch below, at the gold of the aspen all around them. She thought about a train descending through a high pass into a valley she had never seen, and mountains so enormous they made the word enormous seem insufficient, and the way they had not frightened her when they should perhaps have frightened her a little. She thought about a platform and a woman with $12 in a valise and a constitution that does not collapse under pressure, and 3 men at a freight office who each noticed her in a different way. She thought about a general merchandise store and a burned letter and a photograph between 2 survey maps in a kitchen with a lamp burning low and the smell of arnica and the voice of a man saying things he had not said to anyone. She thought about an aspen grove in July with the light coming through the leaves and a plain gold ring in a small box and the way it felt to choose something completely rather than to arrive at it because no other option was available. She leaned her head against his shoulder. Not one, she said. He put his arm around her. His hand, large and calloused and warm from the afternoon's work, rested at her shoulder with the settled weight of something that has been there long enough to belong there. I should have found you sooner, he said. We found each other exactly when we were meant to, she said. The stars were beginning in the east, appearing one by one above the ridgeline. In the order they always appeared, the bright ones first, and then the rest following, until the sky above the Wind River Range was as full of them as it always was on a clear October night. In Wyoming territory, more stars than anyone from a city could be prepared for the kind of sky that makes a person understand why the man who had written to her about it had reached for Thoreau and found him insufficient. She had read about this sky in letters the previous winter, sitting under a lamp in a Boston apartment with $12 and a decision forming in the back of her mind. She had thought reading those words that the man who wrote them understood something about where he lived that went beyond ordinary familiarity. She had been right. She had simply been wrong about which man was writing. The mountains held their positions. The stars completed their arrival. Below them, the ranch settled into the quiet of evening, the particular quality of peace that belongs to places that have been worked well and are now resting from it. Eleanor's voice drifted from the library with another question for Reed, who would answer it as fully as it deserved. The door of the new house, which was not new anymore, stood open behind them. The lamp inside cast its light outward onto the porch boards in a warm rectangle that included both of them. Clara Calloway, who had arrived in Wyoming territory on a May afternoon 10 years earlier, with $12 in a traveling bag and an advertisement for a life that turned out to be the wrong one, stood on her porch under 10 years' worth of autumn stars and felt with the complete and grounded certainty of someone who has tested a thing sufficiently to know its weight that she was exactly where she had always been going. She had simply not known the name of the place until she arrived.